Okay, year 12. Today's session is going to be all about Zoella's target audience, and what we're going to focus on is who Zoella's target audience is, and we're going to be looking at a couple of techniques we've used in the past in order to differentiate who her target audience is. And then in the second half of the lesson, we're also going to think about applying one of our key audience theorists to Zoella. So in the Do Now activity, we spoke about these different age brackets, and we spoke about how all of these age brackets have slightly different tastes when it comes to their media consumption. And what you could argue is that younger age brackets, such as 11 to 15-year-olds, might be more likely to use online media, social media, for example, whereas the older demographic here, 25 to 35-year-olds, you could argue would still use some traditional media forms such as television, radio, or even newspapers. However, I think what we can all agree is that in all of these age brackets, online media has probably become the most prominent form of media that any of them consume, despite their age. And I think you could probably even take this a little bit older as well, because I'd say most people now use online media potentially more than they use any other different forms of media. So when we sort of extend this and start to think about Zoella and who her target audience is, there are two main strategies that we use for profiling. We call these demographics and psychographics, which are two terms which we have discussed before and which I'm sure you will remember. So when it comes to demographic profiling, what we're referring to here is ways of categorizing audiences by dividing them into very straightforward groups such as their age, their sex, their income, their education status, their occupation status. And these are all things which are cold, hard facts, things that we could easily discern, and things that we could very, very, very easily create statistics, etc. And it would be a very easy way for us to break down audiences using that system. Now, the second way is psychographic profiling. Now, psychographic profiling is slightly different to this. Psychographic profiling is a way of thinking about audiences, not just in terms of these basic facts, but also in terms of their personality, their values, what people think about their world, the way that they might vote for a political party, what they might do at the weekend. And what we've discussed before is that whilst demographic profiling is a really good way of us breaking up an audience because they're cold hard facts and we can easily do that, psychographic profiling, we could argue, gives us a richer way of thinking about an audience. It gives us much more detail, much more depth. I think, however, the conclusion that we've generally come to as a class before is the fact that combining these two things together is probably the most accurate way of us thinking about audiences, using both those traditional ways of categorizing audiences, such as their age, their income, etc., but also combining that with their values and their opinions is probably the way that we're going to get the most accurate picture of who a target audience is. So what I'm going to ask you to do for your first task today is to create an audience profile for Zoella. And I'd like you to do this in the form of a mind map if you can, if you have the resources available to you. If you don't have pen and paper available to you, then you can just do this using Microsoft Word or PowerPoint, etc. And what I want you to think about is both of these different profiling techniques, demographics and psychographics. So I want you to think about who her typical target audience is. So who would be a typical audience member for Zoella? Initially in terms of demographics, but then also in terms of what their interests, their values, their beliefs, etc. might be. And what I'd like you to do in this mind map, for each branch that you include, I would also like you to try to write down an example from what you have seen of her content so far. So I imagine that a lot of you are going to write down as one of your first points, one of your first branches here, that her target audience is females. What have you seen so far that tells you that her target audience is females? An example could be the fact that on her website she uses a lot of pastel colours. That is something which is typically associated with femininity. Another example, you might include a psychographic one, and you might say that her target audience are interested in fashion. And for this, you could easily show that some of her videos, for example, feature a lot of fashion tips or examples of clothes which people can buy, etc. So for each branch which you include, in the middle of your mind map, you should have audience profile for Zoella. And then for each branch that you have, whether it be a demographic one or a psychographic one, I'd like you to try to include a very, very, very brief example of where you've seen this in her content which you've seen so far. Now, as a challenge for this, you could also include some points for a secondary audience here. Now, I think that we could probably argue that her primary audience is going to be teenagers, people that are interested in fashion, etc. But what you could also argue is that her secondary audience is people who have grown up with Zoella and are now a bit more mature. Zoella's most recent content doesn't necessarily feature hair tutorials or anything like this. What it actually features is more content about lifestyle and about her business, etc., and about her cooking. So maybe you could argue that her secondary audience now, or even you could argue that's her primary audience and that teenagers are her secondary audience. You could argue it either way. But what is important to realise is that she has more than one audience. She has a primary audience, but she also has secondary audiences as well. So as a challenge, you could also include some points in your profile about secondary audiences as well. Okay, so moving on to the second part of a lesson. Now, there was an Ofcom report in 2016, Ofcom, the Office for Communications, and what they did is some research, and they found out that 5 to 15-year-olds now spend more time online than they do watching television. And to be honest with you, that probably doesn't come as a surprise to you guys at all. That's, I'd say, kind of goes without saying now. And what they found is that YouTube was becoming an increasingly important content destination for young audiences. And they wrote that vloggers provided an important source of teen-orientated content. Now, when we think about Zoella, I think this really rings true, because I think the kind of content which Zoella and other vloggers create, we can see is increasingly more relevant to teenagers, and therefore they are more likely to watch it. And this really reminds me of Gerbner's cultivation theory. Now, Gerbner's cultivation theory is one which we've studied several times in this course so far, so we don't need to go over it in masses of detail again. But just as a quick reminder, what Gerbner argues is that if you are exposed to repeated patterns of representation over time, they may well shape and influence the way that their target audience perceives the world. In other words, they will cultivate their viewpoints and opinions. And as we've spoken about before, cultivation generally works best when it's reinforcing mainstream values. And that's because most media reinforces mainstream values. Most TV shows, most newspapers, and now most online media reinforces those mainstream values. And Zoella, I would argue, is no different to that at all. Now, one way of looking at this which we haven't considered before is the idea of resonance. If something resonates with you, it really strikes a chord. It really hits home with you. And things which resonate with target audiences are more likely to cultivate them. If a target audience has an active interest in what they're consuming, it is more likely to influence their decisions, their viewpoints, their values. If you take me as an example of this, I've spoken to you guys before about how I regularly read, watch and listen to Arsenal blogs, vlogs and podcasts. Now, as someone who supports Arsenal, and with the content creators being people who are very similar to me in terms of both demographics and psychographics, what they produce is more likely to resonate with me. Things that they say are more likely to influence me because I'm interested in what they're talking about, and also I can relate to the people who are saying those words to me. If we take a kind of an obvious difference to this, if I was watching a vlog about Tottenham or about Man United, I would not be as interested in that. The things that were being said there would not resonate with me as much because I don't like those teams. Likewise, Zoella is not someone who resonates with me very much. I am not someone who spends an enormous amount of time cooking. I'm not someone who spends an enormous amount of time looking at female fashion trends, hair, beauty, makeup, etc. So she does not resonate with me as much as my Arsenal vlogs and blogs and podcasts do. So when we think about Gerbner, Gerbner was writing about television. When Gerbner was writing, online media wasn't really a thing. So he was talking about television here. But if you think about that Ofcom report, what that's telling us is that people don't actually watch TV as much as they used to. Nowadays, they spend much more time consuming online media. And actually, what I would argue is because people now spend so much time on online media, in the past they might have watched TV for half an hour, a couple of hours in the evening. Nowadays, people consume online media throughout the day. So actually, the opportunity to cultivate audiences, to make them follow your viewpoints and your opinions, are now much better because there is so much chance to do it, because people spend so much time consuming online media. So you could argue that actually Gerbner's cultivation theory is more relevant now than it's ever been before. So for your application task for this, what I would like you to do is I would like you to browse through Zoella's media empire. So look at her website, one of her videos, one of her social media accounts, and I'd like you to find 3 specific examples of content that could be seen to cultivate her audience. So one example from a video, one from a website, and one from one of her social media accounts. So for example, you could go onto YouTube and you might see in one of her Q&A videos, she discusses her attitude towards fame and managing her time. And this is actually a quote. She says, "It's important to make time for your friends and family." Now, from my point of view, what that shows is that Zoella is reinforcing the classic dominant ideological view that family values are very important, that it's really important above anything else to look after your family and to value your family. So she is cultivating that value in her audience by discussing those different things. And I would like you, as I said, that's one example. I'd like you to find 3 examples. So one example from a website, one from a video, and one from a social media account. It doesn't need to be a hugely detailed example. You just need some sort of quote or some sort of illustration of how that is cultivating the target audience. So just to recap, the 2 tasks which I want you to do today. Firstly, I would like you to create that audience profile for Zoella, and there are more details about that on slide 5, and it should include both demographics and psychographics. And then once you know who her target audience is, I would like you to think about Gerbner, and I would like you to find 3 examples of how Zoella is cultivating that target audience. So how is she and her empire having influence over the target audience? And there are more details about this on slide 8. So I would say that the audience profile should take you no more than about 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes, and then the Gerbner examples the same really, about 15 minutes on that. So just have a brief look through her website, one social media account and one of her videos, and find an example of how she is influencing her audience through that. Now, there are no additional lesson notes required for submission from this lesson because you already know about Gerbner and you already know about demographics and psychographics. So all I would like you to submit is just that audience profile and then the 3 examples of Gerbner, and that is all. If you have any questions at all, then I'll be live on Teams throughout this hour. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was useful.